Chapter 1. The Whisper of the Forest. In the heart of the forested village of Greenshade, time seemed to flow differently, as though the trees themselves measured the passing years with their patient growth. The village was a cradle of simplicity, its wooden cabins nestled among ancient oaks and elms. Life here moved to the rhythm of nature. The sun filtering through a canopy of green, the soft murmur of streams weaving through moss-covered stones, and the gentle calls of birds that filled the air with their timeless melodies. Among the villagers was Amara, an 18-year-old girl whose presence seemed as ethereal as the mist that rolled in each morning. Her auburn hair shimmered like autumn leaves, and her hazel eyes held a quiet curiosity, as though they sought something beyond the boundaries of the forest she called home. Amara had grown up among these trees, learning the secrets they held in their gnarled branches and whispered rustlings. Yet, despite her connection to the land, there was an ache of incompleteness in her heart, a longing she couldn't define. It was during one of her solitary wanderings that she first heard it, the whisper. The sound was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind rustling through the leaves, but it carried an otherworldly quality that sent shivers coursing down her spine. The voice seemed to hum with an ancient energy, luring her deeper into the forest, away from the familiar trails and into an expanse of wild, untamed growth. Amara followed without question, her steps light on the forest floor. The sunlight grew dimmer as the trees thickened, their branches intertwining like a protective veil. The air smelled of earth and damp moss, and every so often, a ray of golden light pierced through the canopy, illuminating her path as if guiding her toward an unseen destination. At last, she emerged into a clearing unlike anything she had ever seen. The space was encircled by towering sequoias, their massive trunks forming a natural cathedral. At the center of the clearing stood a pool of water, its surface so still it seemed like polished glass. The reflection of the sky above shimmered in its depths, but as Amara approached, the image wavered, revealing something else entirely. The pool reflected a pair of eyes, golden and luminous, almost feline. They stared back at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the vision faded, leaving only the tranquil reflection of the sky once more. Amara knelt beside the pool, her fingers trembling as they brushed the water's surface. She felt a strange connection, as if the forest itself had reached out to her. In that moment, she knew her life was about to change. The whisper returned, this time carrying words she could almost understand, their cadence both gentle and commanding. It spoke of a bond, of something forgotten and waiting to be rediscovered. The days that followed were filled with unease and anticipation. Amara's nights were restless, her dreams haunted by the golden eyes and the feeling of being watched. Yet, there was no fear, only a growing sense of curiosity and inevitability. She began to wander further from the village, drawn by an invisible thread. The villagers noticed her absences and whispered among themselves, their voices tinged with superstition. Stories of forest spirits and ancient protectors were part of Greenshade's lore, tales told to keep children from straying too far. But Amara paid them no mind. She felt the forest calling her in a way she could not ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky blushed with hues of orange and purple, Amara found herself back at the clearing. The pool glowed faintly in the twilight, its surface rippling despite the stillness of the air. She knelt once more, her heart pounding with an inexplicable mixture of fear and hope. From the shadows, a figure emerged. Its form was both human and something more, moving with a grace that was unnervingly fluid. The man stood at the edge of the clearing, his broad shoulders draped in a cloak of black fur that glistened like obsidian. His face was strikingly handsome yet wild, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that burned gold even in the fading light. He stepped closer, his presence filling the clearing with an aura of power and mystery. Though no words were spoken, Amara felt the weight of his gaze, as if he were searching her soul for truths she didn't yet understand. The forest seemed to hum around them, the ancient trees bearing witness to a meeting that was fated to happen. Amara felt no urge to run, no need to question. She only knew that the whisper of the forest had brought her here for a reason, and that her journey was only beginning. The night deepened, and as the stars emerged, they cast their light on two figures, a girl and a man, each drawn to the other by forces older than time. Chapter 2. A Heart Between Worlds. The night lingered heavily in the clearing, its darkness velvet-soft yet profound, wrapping Amara and the mysterious man in an intimate stillness. The stars, sharp pinpricks of light, glimmered above them, their cold beauty mirrored faintly in the glassy pool at the center. Amara stood rooted in place, her heart beating with a rhythm that seemed to echo the forest's pulse. The man remained where he was, an imposing silhouette against the backdrop of towering sequoias. As she observed him, Amara felt the pull of something she could neither name nor resist. This was no ordinary man. The air around him shimmered with an energy that seemed to ripple through the very fabric of the forest. Though he had yet to make a sound, his presence spoke volumes. He was an enigma, a creature who straddled two worlds, the primal and the human. Her mind raced with questions, but they quickly gave way to something deeper. A sensation of belonging, as if the forest had been waiting for this encounter. There was no fear, only awe and a strange comfort, as though she had stepped into a story already written, each detail etched in the ancient bark of the trees around her. As the man stepped closer, the moonlight caught him fully, and his appearance became clearer. His physique was lean yet powerful, his muscles moving like liquid beneath his skin, which carried the faint sheen of a jaguar's coat. His golden eyes glowed with an unearthly light, and as he tilted his head slightly, Amara noticed the faint points of ears that were not entirely human. His hair was as dark as the forest's depths, blending seamlessly with the fur that adorned his shoulders and upper arms. Amara felt her breath catch as she realized the truth. He was no man, at least not fully. He was something else entirely, a creature born of the wilderness, a being shaped by the primal forces that governed this ancient forest. She did not know how long they stood there, their gazes locked, the silence of the clearing broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. Time seemed to stretch, the boundaries between minutes and hours blurring into insignificance. Eventually, the man turned, his movements fluid as water, and began to retreat into the shadows of the trees. Amara hesitated, a strange longing blooming in her chest. The pull of the forest was stronger now, its whispers louder, insistent. It was as though the very air urged her to follow, to step beyond the limits of her known world and into the mysteries that awaited. Her feet moved before her mind could decide, carrying her deeper into the forest after the enigmatic figure. The trees loomed closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms, but the path ahead was illuminated faintly by the light of the waxing moon. The man moved with an elegance that defied nature, his steps silent against the forest floor. Though she followed, he never looked back, yet she knew he was aware of her presence. They journeyed through the forest for what felt like hours, the terrain shifting subtly beneath her feet. The air grew cooler, the earthy scent of moss and pine mingling with something sharper, almost metallic. The sounds of the village, chirping crickets and distant murmurs of the stream, faded into the distance, replaced by a deeper silence. At last, they arrived at another clearing, smaller than the first but no less remarkable. The ground here was covered in a thick carpet of ferns, their leaves glistening with dew. At the center stood a massive stone altar, weathered by time and covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and dance in the moonlight. Surrounding the altar were jaguar statues, each one lifelike in detail, their eyes set with glimmering gemstones that seemed to watch Amara as she approached. The man stopped before the altar, turning at last to face her. He raised his hand, and though no words were spoken, Amara felt a surge of energy ripple through her. The carvings on the stone began to glow, their patterns twisting like living vines. The air vibrated with a low hum, a resonance that Amara felt in her very bones. The altar was a gateway, she realized, a connection between the forest's secrets and the tangible world. And this man, this half-human, half-jaguar, was its guardian. The knowledge came to her unbidden, as though whispered into her mind by the forest itself. Her gaze lingered on the altar, and she was struck by a series of visions. She saw the jaguar man's past unfold like a tapestry woven of light and shadow. A child born beneath the canopy, neither fully human nor beast, raised by the forest's spirits. She saw him running through the woods in his jaguar form, his coat blending with the dappled shadows, his golden eyes always searching. She saw pain, too, loss and isolation. He had lived for years untold, his existence hidden from the world of men, bound to the forest by an ancient pact. He was protector, guardian, and prisoner all at once. And now, he had found her. Amara's presence here was no accident. The forest had chosen her, just as it had chosen him so many years ago. Her destiny was entwined with his, their paths crossing like the roots of the ancient trees. As the visions faded, she felt a new understanding settle over her. The forest's whisper had called her to this place, to this man. Her heart, which had always ached for something she could not name, now beat in rhythm with the wild magic that surrounded her. She was no longer merely a girl of Greenshade. She was something more, something not yet fully realized. The jaguar man took a step back, fading into the shadows once more, but this time, Amara did not feel the same ache of separation. She knew their paths would cross again. The bond had been forged, though she could not yet see its full shape. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the forest in hues of gold and rose, Amara stood alone in the clearing, her heart both heavy and light. She had crossed a threshold, one that could never be undone, and though she did not yet understand her role in the story that was unfolding, she knew one thing with certainty. Her life, and the life of the mysterious man, would never be the same. Chapter 3: Shadows that Yearn for Light. The forest awoke with the first blush of dawn, its edges softened by the golden haze of sunlight filtering through the canopy. Amara lingered in the clearing, her heart still humming with the strange resonance of the night before. She traced the patterns in the dew-covered ferns with her fingertips, her mind replaying the visions and the presence of the jaguar man. Though the clearing seemed unchanged, it now carried an air of sacredness, a veil of mystery she could neither lift nor fully understand. The walk back to the village was slow, her steps weighed down by thoughts she could not yet untangle. The path was unfamiliar, winding through denser thickets and uneven terrain. It was as if the forest had shifted during the night, rearranging itself in response to the events that had unfolded. Amara's feet found their way almost instinctively, guided by the pull of the familiar and the unseen forces that now seemed to watch over her. When she finally emerged from the trees, the village of Greenshade seemed distant, like a memory she was revisiting rather than a home she was returning to. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys of wooden cabins, and the scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the earthy aroma of the forest. The villagers moved about their routines, their lives untouched by the secrets lurking just beyond the tree line. Amara's arrival drew a few curious glances. Her absence the previous evening had likely been noticed, but no one approached her with questions. The people of Greenshade had long learned not to pry into the affairs of the forest. Stories of its power, of the spirits and creatures that dwelled within, were woven into their culture, warnings told to children and whispered between neighbors. Yet, despite their caution, Amara could feel their unease. She carried something intangible, an energy that clung to her like the scent of the wild. The forest had marked her, though none could see it. She returned to her small home on the outskirts of the village, a humble structure with walls made from felled pines and a roof thatched with dried grasses. It had belonged to her parents, who had passed on their love of the forest to her. They had taught her its ways, how to recognize its moods, how to listen to its whispers. But even they, for all their wisdom, had not prepared her for what had happened in the clearing. The day passed in a blur. Amara busied herself with mundane tasks, gathering herbs, tending the small vegetable patch behind her house, and mending a tear in her woven shawl. But her mind remained tethered to the forest. The jaguar man's eyes haunted her thoughts, their golden light burning behind her closed lids whenever she tried to rest. She felt as though a thread connected them, invisible but unbreakable, tugging at her soul each time she tried to let the memory fade. As twilight fell once more, Amara found herself drawn back toward the forest. It was not a conscious decision. Her feet carried her there as if moved by an unseen force. The villagers were used to her wanderings, and no one stopped her as she slipped away from the edges of Greenshade and into the embrace of the trees. The forest at dusk was a world unto itself, alive with the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of damp earth and flowering vines. Shadows stretched long across the forest floor, their shapes shifting like living things. Amara walked without hesitation, her steps sure despite the fading light. She was not surprised when she came to the clearing once more. The pool at its center gleamed faintly in the growing darkness, its surface a mirror reflecting the rising stars. The jaguar statues seemed to glow faintly, their gemstone eyes catching the light in a way that felt deliberate. This time, the jaguar man did not make her wait. He emerged from the shadows with the same fluid grace as before, his movements seamless and predatory. He circled the edge of the clearing, his golden eyes fixed on her. Though he made no sound, Amara felt the weight of his presence as though the air itself had thickened. The forest around them seemed to come alive. The wind rustled the trees in a rhythmic cadence, almost like the breath of a sleeping giant. The light of the moon spilled through the branches, dappling the ground in silver patterns. Amara's heart beat in time with the forest, her senses heightened as she stood in his presence. She could feel the connection between them, stronger now, as though it had grown roots overnight. It was not merely a meeting of two beings, but an intertwining of fates, a bond forged by the forest itself. The jaguar man stepped closer, and Amara's breath caught as she noticed details she had missed before. His hands, though human in shape, bore faint claw-like nails. His skin seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight, as if the jaguar within him lay just beneath the surface, ready to emerge. He was neither beast nor man, but something entirely other, a bridge between the wild and the civilized, a creature born of both worlds but belonging fully to neither. As she watched him, she felt a sudden wave of understanding. He was as much a prisoner of the forest as he was its protector. The bond he shared with the land was ancient and unyielding, tying him to its rhythms and secrets. She could feel his yearning, a desire for something beyond the confines of the trees. It mirrored her own longing, the ache she had carried for as long as she could remember. The realization hit her with startling clarity. They were not so different. Two souls caught between worlds, seeking a place where they could truly belong. The clearing seemed to pulse with energy, the air vibrating with an unseen force. Amara closed her eyes, letting the sensation wash over her. She could feel the forest's whisper growing louder, its voice now a symphony of emotions, hope, sorrow, and something that felt like promise. When she opened her eyes, the jaguar man was gone, melted back into the shadows as if he had never been there. But the clearing felt different now, its sacred energy humming in her veins. She knew he would return, just as she would. Their connection was undeniable, and the forest itself seemed to conspire to bring them together. As Amara made her way back to the village, the stars above seemed to shine brighter, their light guiding her steps. She felt a strange sense of peace despite the unanswered questions that lingered in her mind. The jaguar man's presence had awakened something within her, a spark that would not be easily extinguished. The forest whispered its secrets, and Amara listened, her heart open to the journey ahead. Chapter 4. Veins of Moonlight, Roots of Darkness. The morning brought a fragile stillness to Greenshade, the kind that often preceded a storm. Amara awoke with the sense that the forest had shifted again during the night. It was a subtle change, one that couldn't be seen but felt, a deeper resonance in the earth, a hum in the air that seemed to vibrate beneath her skin. She sat at the edge of her small cot, her fingers brushing against the fabric of her shawl as her thoughts lingered on the jaguar man. The connection she felt to him had not dulled with sleep. If anything, it had intensified, weaving itself into her thoughts and dreams. The golden glow of his eyes and the primal energy he exuded haunted her, but it was not fear she felt. Instead, it was a pull, a tether to something she could not yet name but could no longer ignore. She stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The village was already alive with the sounds of daily life. The distant clatter of tools, the low murmur of voices, and the soft rustle of chickens foraging near their coops. Yet, none of it seemed real to her anymore. Greenshade was her home, but it felt like a shell now, a place she inhabited but no longer belonged to. Her heart was with the forest. Amara made her way toward the tree lean, her movements purposeful but unhurried. She carried a small satchel with her, its contents practical: bread, dried fruits, a flask of water. It was a habit her parents had instilled in her, the understanding that the forest, though beautiful, could be unforgiving. The air grew cooler as she entered the woods, the dense canopy above casting dappled shadows on the ground. The path she took was not the same as the night before, yet her feet moved with certainty, as though guided by an unseen force. The forest whispered to her again, its voice soft but insistent, leading her deeper into its heart. As she walked, the landscape began to change. The trees grew taller and older, their bark gnarled with age and their roots weaving intricate patterns across the ground. The air grew thicker, charged with a faint energy that made her skin tingle. This was no ordinary part of the forest. This was its soul, the place where its secrets were most deeply rooted. The sound of running water reached her ears, a soft, melodic trickle that drew her toward a hidden stream. The water was impossibly clear, reflecting the pale morning light like liquid glass. Amara knelt beside it, her fingers dipping into the cool current. The forest seemed to sigh around her, its energy settling as if in approval. It was then that she noticed the tracks. They were faint but unmistakable, paw prints larger than any animal she had ever seen. The edges of the prints were blurred, as though they were not fully of this world, and they followed the stream upstream into the shadows. Amara rose, her pulse quickening as she followed the trail. The prints wound through the trees, their path deliberate and unyielding. The forest grew darker as she went, the light dimmed by the density of the foliage. The air felt alive now, charged with an intensity that made her heart race. The trail led her to another clearing, smaller and more secluded than the one before. Here, the trees formed a natural archway, Their branches intertwined to create a canopy that filtered the light into ribbons of silver and gold. At the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its trunk as wide as a house and its roots plunging deep into the earth. The jaguar man was there, his form partially hidden by the shadows of the tree. He moved with a grace that defied reason, his steps silent as he circled the clearing. The air around him seemed to ripple, as though his very presence disrupted the fabric of reality. Amara's breath caught as she stepped into the clearing, her gaze locking with his. The connection between them flared to life once more, stronger than before. It was as though the forest itself recognized her now, welcoming her into its most sacred space. The jaguar man's movements slowed, and he turned his gaze toward her fully. In the stillness of the clearing, she felt a surge of emotions, not her own, but his. They were wild and raw, a torrent of feelings that seemed to spill from him and into the space around them. She felt his yearning, a deep ache that mirrored her own. It was a longing for freedom, for understanding, for a connection that transcended the boundaries of his existence. He was a creature caught between worlds, just as she was, a soul tethered to the forest yet yearning for something beyond it. The energy in the clearing grew heavier, the air vibrating with an intensity that made the ground beneath her feet feel alive. The jaguar man raised his hand, and though no words were spoken, Amara felt the force of his intent. The massive tree at the center of the clearing began to glow faintly, its bark pulsing with a soft, golden light. Patterns appeared on its surface, symbols and shapes that seemed to shift and move as she watched. It was a language she could not read but somehow understood, a story etched into the very fibers of the tree. Through the symbols, she saw glimpses of his past once more. She saw his birth beneath a full moon, his cries mingling with the roar of a jaguar in the distance. She saw his childhood, a time of isolation and discovery, as he learned to navigate the duality of his nature. She saw his role as the guardian of the forest, a duty that bound him to its secrets and protected its heart from those who would harm it. And then she saw herself. Her image appeared among the symbols, her presence intertwined with his in a way that felt both ancient and new. The forest had chosen her, just as it had chosen him, and their destinies were now irrevocably linked. As the visions faded, Amara felt a deep sense of clarity. She understood now why she had been drawn to the forest, why her heart had always yearned for something beyond the confines of Greenshade. She was not merely a visitor to this place. She was a part of it, as much as the jaguar man and the ancient tree. The jaguar man moved closer, his golden eyes glowing with an intensity that made her heart pound. Though his expression was unreadable, she felt the depth of his emotions, the hope, the fear, and the unspoken promise that bound them together. As the light of the tree dimmed, the clearing fell into shadow once more. The jaguar man turned and melted into the forest, his movements as seamless as the wind. Amara stood alone, the weight of her newfound understanding settling over her like a mantle. She did not return to Greenshade that night. Instead, she sat beneath the ancient tree, its roots cradling her like a mother's arms. The forest whispered around her, its voice soft and steady, weaving a song of promises and possibilities. And as the moon rose high above the canopy, Amara closed her eyes and let herself be carried by its melody, her heart open to whatever the forest would bring next. Chapter 5. The Dance of Beasts and Souls. The forest stirred with life as dawn broke, the delicate balance of its ecosystem waking in symphony. Each leaf, branch, and creature seemed attuned to the shift in energy that had begun to ripple through the trees. Amara rose from her resting place beneath the ancient tree, her limbs stiff but her heart alive with the same quiet hum that seemed to pulse through the forest. The clearing around her had changed in the early light. The tree's massive roots seemed more vibrant, their twisted tendrils wrapped in moss that glowed faintly under the morning sun. The symbols she had seen the night before were gone, their meaning imprinted in her mind but hidden from the world once more. Amara stretched, the ache in her muscles a small price to pay for the clarity she now carried. She had not slept in the conventional sense, but the forest had offered her something more profound, a sense of renewal, a connection to its eternal rhythms. She felt less like an outsider now, more like a thread woven into its vast tapestry. The walk back to Greenshade was unhurried, her steps guided by instinct rather than memory. The forest seemed to part for her, its trails revealing themselves in ways that defied logic. As she moved, she could feel the lingering presence of the jaguar man, not physically but in the atmosphere, as if his essence had bled into the land itself. She reached the village by mid-morning, the sight of its familiar rooftops stirring a faint pang of unease. It was strange how quickly things had shifted. Greenshade, once her sanctuary, now felt like a place of confinement. The villagers moved about their routines, unaware of the secrets that lay hidden just beyond the tree-line. Amara wondered how long she could keep her connection to the forest concealed, or if it even mattered anymore. The day unfolded in its usual rhythm. Amara went about her chores, her hands occupied while her mind wandered. She tended the garden, weaving through rows of carrots and potatoes, her fingers sinking into the soil with a newfound reverence. She fetched water from the well, its cool weight grounding her in the present moment. Yet, no matter how hard she tried, her thoughts always returned to him, the jaguar man, with his golden eyes and the primal grace of his movements. By the time the sun began its descent, casting the village in warm hues of amber and gold, Amara knew she would return to the forest that night. The pull was too strong to resist, a silent call that echoed in her chest. She prepared for her journey as the evening shadows lengthened, her satchel packed with provisions and her heart steeled for whatever awaited her. The forest at dusk was a different world, its edges blurred by the interplay of light and shadow. The trees loomed taller, their trunks wrapped in the deepening blues of twilight. The air was cooler now, tinged with the earthy scent of moss and fallen leaves. Amara found herself wandering without a clear destination, her path dictated by the rhythms of the forest. The sounds of nocturnal life grew around her. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, and the distant cry of something wilder. She moved with purpose, but without haste, her steps guided by an intuition she was beginning to trust. She felt his presence before she saw him, a ripple in the stillness that made her pulse quicken. The jaguar man emerged from the shadows, his movements fluid and deliberate. His form was illuminated by the faint light of the moon, casting his features in sharp relief. He was neither fully human nor fully beast, but a perfect amalgamation of the two, his duality evident in every step he took. The space between them was charged with an energy that felt almost tangible. Amara could feel it in the air, a current that connected them in ways she still could not fully comprehend. He circled her slowly, his golden eyes watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. There was no malice in his gaze, only curiosity and something deeper, something that felt like recognition. The clearing around them seemed to respond to their presence. The trees swayed in a wind that did not touch the ground, their leaves whispering a song that was both mournful and exultant. The earth beneath their feet pulsed faintly, as if the forest itself was alive and bearing witness to their meeting. Amara stood still, her breath steady despite the wild beat of her heart. She felt no fear, only the weight of the moment and the unspoken promise it carried. The jaguar man stepped closer, his movements deliberate but unthreatening. He extended a hand, or was it a paw, toward her, the gesture both alien and achingly familiar. In that instant, She felt a surge of emotion that was not her own. It was a torrent of feelings, loneliness, longing, hope, that seemed to pour from him and into her. She understood now that his dual nature was not just a physical trait but an emotional burden, a constant tension between the wild instincts of the jaguar and the human soul that yearned for connection. The bond between them deepened, the air around them growing thicker with unspoken understanding. Amara felt herself leaning into the connection, her own emotions rising to meet his. Her life in Greenshade, the village routines that had once felt so safe, seemed distant now, irrelevant in the face of this newfound purpose. The Jaguar man moved closer still, his presence overwhelming yet comforting. Amara could see the details of his form now, the sharp contours of his face, the faint shimmer of his fur, and the way his eyes held a light that seemed to pierce through her very being. He was beautiful and terrifying, a creature of contradictions that mirrored her own inner turmoil. The forest seemed to hold its breath as they stood there, two beings connected by forces beyond their understanding. Amara felt a deep sense of peace despite the storm of emotions swirling around them. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, not as a girl from Greenshade or a wanderer of the woods, but as someone who belonged, truly and irrevocably. As the moon rose higher, bathing the clearing in silver light, the Jaguar man stepped back into the shadows. Amara watched as his form disappeared, leaving only the faintest rustle of leaves in his wake. But she did not feel abandoned. She knew now that he was never truly gone, just as the forest was never truly silent. Amara turned and began her journey back to the village, her heart heavy with questions but light with purpose. The dance had begun, and she knew she was a part of something far greater than herself. The forest whispered its secrets, and she was ready to listen. Chapter 6: Whispers of Flesh and Fur. The dawn came softly, threading its pale golden fingers through the canopy of Greenshade. The village lay quiet, wrapped in the embrace of the waking forest. Amara sat by her window, staring out at the horizon as the sunlight touched the rooftops and danced across the fields. Yet her heart was elsewhere, tangled in the shadows of the woods, where the Jaguar man had left his indelible mark upon her soul. Her dreams the night before had been vivid and strange. She had walked through the forest in her mind, her feet bare against the damp earth as the whispers of the trees guided her. There had been flashes of the Jaguar man, his eyes glowing in the dark, his form shifting between man and beast as he prowled the edges of her vision. The dreams were not frightening but rather a beckoning, a call she could not ignore. By midday, the pull to the forest was unbearable. Amara found herself drawn back to the tree-line, her movements brisk but unhurried. She carried her satchel, its weight light but grounding, as she entered the cool shadows of the woods. The village behind her faded into irrelevance, swallowed by the vastness of the trees. The path she took felt familiar, though she knew she had never walked it before. The forest seemed to guide her, its whispers weaving around her like a melody only she could hear. The air grew cooler the deeper she went, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in fractured beams. The woods were alive with movement, birds flitting between branches, squirrels darting through the underbrush, and the occasional rustle of something larger hidden in the shadows. Amara's thoughts wandered to the Jaguar man. She had pieced together fragments of his story from the visions the ancient tree had revealed. He was more than a guardian. He was a creature born of the forest itself, a being caught between two worlds. His humanity and his wildness were not separate but intertwined, each fighting for dominance yet finding harmony in their struggle. Her mind raced with questions. How had he come to be? What was his purpose in the grand design of the forest? And why had she, of all people, been drawn to him? These thoughts consumed her as she moved deeper into the woods, her steps light but deliberate. The forest opened into a clearing she had not seen before, a space bathed in an ethereal light that seemed to come from the very air itself. At the center of the clearing stood a pool of water, its surface as smooth as glass. The pool reflected the sky above, though no sunlight reached it directly. It was as though the forest had created this space as a sanctuary, a place untouched by the outside world. Amara approached the water's edge, her reflection rippling as she knelt beside it. The air was thick with a sense of anticipation, the kind that came before a storm. She dipped her fingers into the pool, its cool touch sending a shiver through her. The jaguar man appeared then, his presence as sudden as it was inevitable. He stepped into the clearing with a grace that made no sound, his golden eyes fixed on her. In the light of the clearing, his form seemed more defined, the edges of his humanity and wildness blending seamlessly. His movements were fluid, his muscles rippling beneath his skin like a predator in its prime. Amara rose to meet him, her heart pounding but her body steady. The connection between them flared to life once more, a current that flowed through the clearing and bound them together. She felt his emotions as if they were her own, a mix of curiosity, longing, and something deeper, something primal. The jaguar man circled her slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. His presence was overwhelming yet comforting, a paradox she was beginning to understand. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the space between them closed, the air thick with unspoken understanding. Amara's thoughts quieted as she focused on him, her awareness narrowing to the sound of his breathing and the way his golden eyes seemed to pierce through her. She felt the pulse of the forest beneath her feet, its energy thrumming in time with her heartbeat. The jaguar man extended his hand toward her, the gesture hesitant but deliberate. She reached out to meet him, their fingers, his clawed, hers soft, brushing for the briefest moment. The connection sent a shock through her, a wave of emotion and energy that left her breathless. She felt his wildness, the raw power of the jaguar that lurked beneath his skin. She also felt his humanity, the quiet ache of a soul that longed for understanding. The pool at the center of the clearing began to glow faintly, its surface rippling with light that seemed to come from within. Symbols appeared once more, their shapes shifting and flowing like water. They told a story she could not fully understand, but their meaning resonated deep within her. Through the symbols, she saw glimpses of the jaguar man's past. She saw his transformation under the light of the moon, his body bending and breaking as the jaguar took form. She saw his solitude, the years he had spent alone in the forest, protecting its secrets and bearing its burdens. She saw his yearning, a deep, unrelenting desire for connection that had led him to her. As the visions faded, Amara felt a new sense of clarity. The jaguar man was not merely a creature of the forest. He was a part of its soul, a being that existed to maintain its balance. And she, too, was now a part of that balance, drawn into a world she had only begun to understand. The jaguar man stepped back, his golden eyes filled with an emotion she could not name. He disappeared into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared, leaving her alone once more. But the clearing did not feel empty. The forest pulsed with life, its energy a constant reminder of the connection they shared. Amara stood by the pool, her reflection rippling as she stared into its depths. She knew now that her life in Greenshade was no longer enough. The forest had claimed her, just as it had claimed the jaguar man, and she could no longer deny the pull of its call. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the clearing in twilight, Amara turned and made her way back toward the village. Her steps were slow but steady, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. She did not know what the future held, but she knew she could no longer walk away from the forest or the jaguar man who had become its beating heart. Chapter 7. The Forest's Veiled Heart. The air was thick with the scent of rain as Amara woke, The morning sky an endless expanse of pale gray. Clouds hung low over Greenshade, casting the village in a muted, silvery light. The storm had not yet arrived, but the forest whispered of its inevitability, the tension in the air almost palpable. Amara felt the weight of the previous night's revelations like a stone in her chest. The forest had shown her its secrets, and though the images remained fragmented in her mind, their meaning was undeniable. She had glimpsed a world far older and deeper than she could comprehend, a world where her role was still unclear. She spent the morning in quiet preparation, her hands busy with mundane tasks while her thoughts roamed free. She knew she could not linger in Greenshade much longer. The pull of the forest had grown stronger, its call no longer something she could resist. The Jaguar Man, with his haunting golden eyes, was now inextricably tied to her fate. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Amara gathered her satchel and stepped outside. The village was subdued, its usual bustle dulled by the impending storm. She avoided the watchful eyes of the villagers, slipping into the forest unnoticed. The trees welcomed her with their familiar embrace, the canopy shielding her from the rain that had begun to intensify. The forest was different in the rain, its edges softened by the mist that clung to the ground. The sound of raindrops on leaves filled the air, a rhythmic percussion that seemed to echo the beating of her heart. Amara walked with purpose, her feet finding the path as if guided by an unseen hand. She knew where she was going, though she had never been there before. The vision from the pool had etched itself into her mind, a place deep within the forest, where the trees grew so tall their tops disappeared into the sky, and the air was heavy with ancient magic. It was a place of power, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. The journey was long, the rain soaking through her clothes and chilling her to the bone. Yet Amara pressed on, driven by a sense of urgency she could not explain. The forest seemed to shift around her, its trails twisting and bending as if testing her resolve. But she did not falter, her determination unshaken. Hours passed before she reached the heart of the forest, a clearing unlike any she had seen before. The trees here were colossal, their trunks wider than houses, their roots twisting like giant serpents through the earth. The air was thick with mist, the ground carpeted in moss that glowed faintly in the dim light. At the center of the clearing stood a massive stone altar, its surface etched with symbols that pulsed with a faint blue light. The altar seemed to hum with energy, a vibration that resonated in Amara's chest. She approached it cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the moss. The Jaguar Man appeared as if summoned by her presence, stepping out of the shadows with a grace that was both human and animal. He was drenched from the rain, his dark hair clinging to his face, the faint shimmer of his fur catching the pale light. His golden eyes met hers, and for a moment, the storm around them seemed to fade into silence. Amara felt the connection between them flare to life once more, stronger now than it had ever been. She could feel his emotions as if they were her own, a mix of relief, curiosity, and something deeper, something that felt like trust. The Jaguar Man stepped closer, his movements deliberate but unthreatening, and gestured toward the altar. The symbols on the stone shifted as Amara approached, their patterns rearranging themselves into shapes she could almost understand. She placed her hands on the cool surface, a surge of energy coursing through her body. The forest seemed to come alive around her, the trees swaying in a wind that did not touch her skin, the air thick with the sound of distant whispers. Visions flooded her mind, each one more vivid than the last. She saw the Jaguar Man's creation, a ritual performed under the light of a blood-red moon. She saw the forest's ancient guardians, creatures of immense power who had walked these woods long before humans had claimed the land. She saw the balance that the Jaguar Man was sworn to protect, a fragile harmony between the wild and the human worlds. But she also saw the cracks in that balance. She saw the encroachment of humanity, the forests cut down and the rivers poisoned. She saw the pain of the jaguar man, his struggle to uphold his duty in a world that no longer respected the old ways. And she saw herself, a figure standing at the edge of it all, caught between two worlds but belonging fully to neither. As the visions faded, Amara felt a deep sense of purpose settle over her. She did not fully understand her role, but she knew she was a part of this now. The forest had chosen her, just as it had chosen the jaguar man, and there was no turning back. The jaguar man stepped closer, his golden eyes filled with an intensity that made her breath catch. He reached out, his clawed hand brushing against hers. The connection between them deepened, the air around them charged with unspoken understanding. Amara felt his emotions flood into her once more, a mixture of hope, determination, and something that felt achingly close to love. The storm above them began to break, the rain slowing to a gentle drizzle as the clouds parted. A beam of sunlight pierced through the canopy, illuminating the altar and the two figures standing before it. The forest seemed to exhale, its tension easing as the balance began to shift. Amara knew this was only the beginning. The journey ahead would be long and uncertain, fraught with challenges she could not yet imagine. But for the first time, she felt ready to face it. She was not alone in this. The jaguar man was with her, their fates intertwined in ways she was only beginning to understand. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in hues of gold and amber, Amara turned and began the journey back to Greenshade. The jaguar man did not follow, but she could feel his presence, a constant reminder of the bond they shared. The forest whispered its secrets, its ancient rhythms pulsing beneath her feet. Amara walked with a sense of purpose she had never known, her heart steady despite the unknown path ahead. She was a part of the forest now, a thread woven into its endless tapestry, and she knew, deep in her soul, that she would never walk alone again. Chapter 8. The Boundary of Two Worlds. The following days unfolded like a fragile web, each moment a delicate thread connecting Amara to the forest and its mysteries. Greenshade moved on as it always had, its rhythm unaffected by the storm that had passed or the secrets Amara now carried. Yet for her, the village felt more distant than ever, as though the weight of her revelation had placed an invisible barrier between her and the lives she had once known so intimately. The townspeople went about their routines, their faces familiar but their presence oddly foreign. Amara found herself slipping into the background, her visits to the village square brief and unremarkable. She no longer lingered by the market stalls or listened to the idle chatter of the other villagers. Instead, her time was spent on the edge of the forest, the boundary between two worlds becoming her refuge. Her father, ever practical and unyielding, had noticed her changes. She could feel his concern in the way he watched her, his silence heavy with unspoken questions. Yet she offered no explanations, unable to put into words the magnitude of what she was experiencing. How could she describe the pull of the forest, the connection to the jaguar man, and the visions that had opened her eyes to a reality far greater than the confines of Greenshade? Amara's days became a blend of the mundane and the extraordinary. By day, she tended to her chores, her hands working mechanically as her mind wandered to the forest. By night, she dreamed of the jaguar man, his golden eyes a constant presence in the shadowy landscapes of her sleep. The forest called to her, its whispers growing louder with each passing day, urging her to return. It was on the third evening after her visit to the altar that she found herself standing at the edge of the forest once more. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of deep orange and soft lavender. The air was warm and heavy, the scent of earth and greenery wrapping around her like a cloak. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the woods, the trees closing around her like old friends. The forest seemed to welcome her back, its paths more familiar now than the streets of Greenshade. The sounds of the woods enveloped her, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the steady hum of life that thrummed beneath the surface. The tension she had carried all day began to ease, her steps growing lighter as she moved deeper into the trees. As night fell, the forest transformed. The darkness was not oppressive but alive, the glow of fireflies casting a soft, ethereal light. Shadows danced between the trees, their shapes shifting in ways that seemed almost deliberate. The air was cooler now, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and moss. Amara felt the presence of the jaguar man before she saw him, a ripple in the atmosphere that sent a shiver down her spine. He emerged from the shadows with the same quiet grace as before, his golden eyes catching the faint light and reflecting it back at her. His form was more defined in the moonlight, his movements fluid and deliberate. There was a stillness about him that commanded attention, a quiet power that made the forest itself seem to pause in reverence. Amara felt the connection between them surge to life, a current that flowed through the space between them. She could feel his emotions once more, a mixture of curiosity, resolve, and something deeper, something that felt like longing. The jaguar man circled her slowly, his gaze never leaving hers, as though he were studying her, searching for something unspoken. She felt no fear, only a deep sense of belonging. The jaguar man was not a stranger to her now. He was a part of her, a thread in the tapestry of her life that could not be unraveled. She reached out to him, her hand brushing against the edge of his fur. The touch was brief but electric, a spark that seemed to ignite the air around them. The forest responded to their connection, its energy pulsing in time with their shared heartbeat. The trees swayed gently despite the stillness of the air, their branches bending as if in acknowledgement of the bond between human and beast. The ground beneath them seemed to hum with life, the moss glowing faintly as if to illuminate their path. The jaguar man led her deeper into the woods, his movements confident and sure. Amara followed without hesitation, her steps guided by an instinct she did not fully understand. They moved in silence, the forest their only companion, until they reached a place unlike any she had seen before. It was a glade bathed in moonlight, the trees forming a natural arch around its edges. At the center stood another altar, smaller than the one she had seen before, but no less significant. The symbols carved into its surface glowed softly, their patterns shifting like water. The air was thick with magic, the kind that felt ancient and unyielding. The jaguar man gestured toward the altar, his movements deliberate but unhurried. Amara approached it slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. As her hands touched the cool stone, she felt the familiar surge of energy, the visions flooding her mind once more. This time, the images were clearer. She saw herself standing at the edge of the forest, a bridge between two worlds. She saw the jaguar man beside her, their bond of force that radiated outward, touching everything it encountered. She saw the balance they were meant to uphold, a harmony that could not exist without their union. But she also saw the challenges that lay ahead. She saw the encroachment of humanity, its greed and destruction threatening to unravel the delicate fabric of the forest. She saw the jaguar man's struggle, his duty as a guardian tested by forces beyond his control. And she saw her own role, her choices shaping the future in ways she could not yet comprehend. As the visions faded, Amara felt a sense of clarity wash over her. She understood now that her place was here, in the forest, at the boundary of two worlds. The jaguar man was not just her guide but her partner, their fates intertwined in a dance as old as the trees themselves. The jaguar man stepped closer, his golden eyes filled with an emotion that left her breathless. The forest around them seemed to exhale, its tension easing as the balance shifted once more. Amara knew their journey was far from over, but for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. The night stretched on as the forest enveloped them, its ancient rhythm guiding their steps. Amara walked beside the jaguar man, their connection a constant reminder of the bond they shared. She was no longer just a girl from Greenshade. She was a part of the forest now, a thread in its endless story. And as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Amara felt a quiet certainty settle over her. Whatever the future held, she would face it with the jaguar man by her side, their paths forever intertwined. Chapter 9. A Love Written in the Stars. The following days in Greenshade passed like a slow, steady river, its current unyielding and constant. Yet Amara felt every moment as though it carried her further away from the life she had known. The village seemed to close in around her, its once familiar streets now echoing with a sense of isolation. She had walked these paths all her life, but now they felt foreign, disconnected from the pulse of the world she had begun to understand. Her father, ever watchful, had noticed the changes in her. His concern was quiet but palpable, a weight in the air that hung between them, thick with unspoken words. Yet Amara could offer him no answers. How could she explain the depths of her connection to the forest, to the jaguar man, and to the ancient power that seemed to awaken within her each time she ventured into the woods? She could not share what she did not fully understand herself. The forest had become both her refuge and her prison. Each time she stepped into its embrace, she felt the ancient magic surrounding her, its presence like a heavy cloak draped over her shoulders. The jaguar man was there, a shadow beside her, always present but never fully understood. Their bond had deepened since their last encounter, but there were still so many unanswered questions that lingered in her heart. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of amber and violet, Amara once again found herself drawn to the forest's edge. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and earth. It was a familiar feeling, one that seemed to call her into the woods, urging her to follow. She stepped into the forest without hesitation, the canopy above her shielding her from the gathering storm. The trees whispered as she passed, their branches swaying in time with the wind. The forest felt alive tonight, its energy more charged than she had ever felt before. She walked with purpose, her feet finding their way along the winding trails without conscious thought. The deeper she ventured, the more the air seemed to shift. It was as if the forest itself had become aware of her presence, its very heart beating in time with her own. The jaguar man was with her, though she could not see him. She felt his gaze, a constant weight on her, as though he were watching from the shadows. She had grown accustomed to his presence, but tonight something felt different. The path led her to a clearing she had not visited before. The trees here were ancient, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their roots curling up from the ground like sleeping serpents. The air was thick with mist, and the ground was slick with moisture from the rain that had begun to fall. Amara could feel the energy of the place vibrating beneath her feet, a low hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. In the center of the clearing stood a stone pillar, covered in moss and ivy, its surface etched with symbols she could not decipher. The stone seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and Amara felt drawn to it, the pull of the pillar stronger than anything she had ever felt before. As she approached, the air grew colder, the mist swirling around her in eerie patterns. The jaguar man materialized from the shadows, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. He watched her carefully, his presence both comforting and unsettling. There was an intensity in his gaze tonight, a weight that seemed to press down on her chest. Amara reached out to touch the stone pillar, her fingers brushing against its rough surface. The moment her skin made contact, a jolt of energy shot through her, sharp and powerful. The world around her seemed to ripple, and for a brief moment, she felt as though she were standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. The air crackled with power, and Amara could feel the pulse of ancient magic flowing through her, filling her with a sense of awe and dread. The Jaguar Man stepped forward, his eyes fixed on her as though he were waiting for something. His presence grew stronger, his energy intertwining with hers. For a moment, they stood together in the silence of the clearing, connected not by words, but by the power that surrounded them. Amara could feel the weight of the forest pressing in around her, its secrets unfolding like petals of a dark flower. She had always known that her connection to the Jaguar Man was more than a bond between two individuals. It was a thread that tied her to the very heart of the forest, to the ancient powers that lay hidden beneath its surface. But tonight, the truth of that connection was clearer than ever. She could feel the forest's pulse beneath her fingertips, the heartbeat of the earth itself. It was as though the trees, the stone, and the air were all part of a greater, unseen whole, and she was now a part of it too. The Jaguar Man's presence was a constant reminder of this, his form both human and beast, a living symbol of the forest's power and mystery. The air around them grew heavier, the tension in the space between them almost tangible. Amara could feel something shifting, something dark and unspoken. The Jaguar Man's gaze never left her, his expression unreadable. It was as though he were waiting for her to make a choice, a decision that would change the course of everything. Amara's heart raced as the weight of his gaze settled on her. She had always known that there was more to the forest, to her connection with it, than she could understand. But now, standing before the stone pillar, with the Jaguar Man by her side, she realized that the forest's shadows held something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The stone pulsed again, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate through her bones. The Jaguar Man's golden eyes flickered with something she could not name, a mix of concern and something darker, something that hinted at the danger they were both facing. The forest was watching them, waiting for them to make a choice that would either restore the balance or shatter it entirely. Amara pulled her hand away from the stone, her breath shallow and quick. The connection between her and the Jaguar Man was palpable, their energies intertwining as they stood together in the center of the clearing. The world seemed to hold its breath, the silence stretching between them like an eternity. She knew then, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that the path ahead would not be easy. The forest's magic, its ancient power, was not a force to be taken lightly, and the Jaguar Man, bound to it as he was, could not protect her from everything. They were not just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for the survival of the balance itself. The rain began to fall harder, the mist swirling around them like a living thing. The Jaguar Man stepped closer, his presence a constant anchor in the storm. Together, they stood at the boundary of two worlds, one human, one ancient, and the weight of the shadows that surrounded them pressed down on their shoulders like an unspoken promise. Amara took a deep breath, feeling the pull of the forest's heart beneath her feet. She was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The journey had only just begun, but she knew one thing for certain: she would not face it alone. Chapter 10. The Echo of a Forgotten Promise. The days following the revelation in the clearing felt like a blur to Amara, as though she were walking in two worlds at once, straddling the line between the familiar and the unknown. Greenshade, with its winding paths and sleepy cottages, seemed to fade into the distance each time she stepped into the woods. The village's daily hum, its simple routines, the laughter of children, the clinking of tools in the blacksmith's forge, was becoming more and more a distant memory. It was the forest that called to her now, pulling her deeper with every passing moment, urging her to uncover its forgotten secrets. Amara found herself returning to the same clearing again and again. the stone pillar standing at its center like an ancient sentinel, waiting for her. Each time she touched its surface, the pulsing energy surged through her, a reminder that the forest held more than just trees and earth. It was a living thing, ancient and bound to forces beyond her understanding. The jaguar man was always there, his presence a constant, his golden eyes watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. There was no need for words between them. They were connected in a way that transcended language, their bond deeper than anything she had known before. But despite their growing connection, Amara could not shake the sense of unease that had settled in her chest. She had felt it the first time she touched the stone pillar, and it had only grown stronger with each visit. The forest's magic was not something to be taken lightly. It was a power that demanded respect, a force that could not be controlled. The jaguar man had never said as much, but Amara could sense it in the way he moved, in the way he watched over her. There was something he was not telling her, a truth he was guarding closely. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold, Amara found herself standing at the edge of the forest once more. The air was thick with the scent of rain, the clouds hanging low in the sky like a heavy curtain. She could feel the change in the atmosphere, the weight of the storm pressing down on her shoulders. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The jaguar man appeared from the shadows as he always did, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. There was something different in his posture tonight, a tension that lingered in the air around him. He was not as close as he had been in their previous encounters. Instead, he stood at a distance, his gaze fixed on her, waiting for her to make the first move. Amara felt the familiar pull of the forest's magic, the energy vibrating beneath her skin. She stepped forward, her feet guided by some unseen force. As she moved deeper into the woods, the air around her seemed to grow thicker, the trees closing in on her like ancient sentinels. The path was familiar, yet it felt different now, as though the forest itself had changed. The trees groaned softly as the wind began to pick up, their branches swaying in unison, like a choir singing a song of warning. The jaguar man followed her, his presence a constant shadow at her side. Amara could feel the weight of his gaze, the pull of his energy intertwining with hers. It was as though they were two halves of a whole, each step they took together a step further into the heart of the forest's secrets. The path led them to the stone pillar once again, its surface glowing faintly in the fading light. Amara approached it without hesitation, her hand reaching out to touch its cool surface. As her fingers made contact, a surge of power coursed through her, stronger than it had ever been before. The forest seemed to tremble, and the air crackled with energy. Amara could feel the magic building around her, gathering in the space between her and the jaguar man. But this time, there was something different. As her hand rested on the stone, she felt a sudden shift, as though the world around her was folding in on itself. The pulse of the pillar grew stronger, and Amara could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on her. The forest's power was not just a force of nature. It was a memory, a living testament to the promises made long ago. The jaguar man stepped closer, his golden eyes locked on hers. For the first time, she saw something in his gaze that she had never seen before. Fear. It was fleeting, gone almost as quickly as it had appeared, but it left a mark on her heart. Whatever was happening, whatever power they were awakening, it was not without consequences. The stone beneath her fingers began to hum, the energy pulsing like the beat of a drum. Amara felt the magic surge through her, filling every corner of her being, pushing against the boundaries of her body. She could feel it reaching out, drawing on the forces of the earth, of the trees, of everything that had come before her. It was as though the forest was calling her to remember something, something ancient and forgotten. And then, In the silence that followed, she remembered. She saw a vision, clear and vivid, unfolding before her eyes. She saw herself standing in this very clearing, her hand on the stone, but she was not alone. Beside her stood a figure, a woman, tall and regal, her features sharp and defined. She wore a crown of leaves, and her eyes were the color of the earth itself, deep and knowing. The woman reached out to her, her hand resting gently on Amara's shoulder. The vision was not a memory, but a promise made long ago, before Amara was born. The woman spoke without words, her voice resonating in Amara's mind like the sound of a distant bell. It was a warning, a reminder of a promise that had been broken, a debt that had yet to be paid. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, but its presence lingered in the air, thick and heavy, like a fog that refused to lift. Amara gasped, pulling her hand away from the stone as the world around her shifted back into focus. The jaguar man stepped forward, his gaze intense, but his eyes were no longer filled with fear. Instead, there was a quiet resignation, a recognition of the weight they now carried together. The forest was silent once more, but its magic thrummed beneath the surface, a reminder of the power that had been awakened. Amara stood in the clearing, her heart pounding in her chest, the echoes of the vision still ringing in her mind. She had learned something new, something that changed everything she thought she knew about herself and the forest. The jaguar man reached out, his hand brushing against hers, and in that moment, Amara understood. The promise had not been broken. It was still waiting to be fulfilled. The debt was hers to repay, and the forest, with all its magic and power, would guide her toward the truth. They turned and walked back into the woods, the weight of the vision heavy on their shoulders. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Amara's journey had only just begun. Chapter 11. The Veil of Unspoken Truths. The forest seemed to hold its breath in the days following Amara's vision. Every step she took felt like a whisper against the stillness, as though the trees themselves were waiting for her to make the next move. The jaguar man's presence had grown more pronounced, his shadow always a step behind her, his energy intertwined with hers in a way that felt both familiar and unsettling. Though he no longer lingered in the shadows as he once had, the space between them still felt charged, as if the world itself had paused, awaiting her next decision. Greenshade, too, seemed to shift. Amara could no longer ignore the distance that had grown between her and the village. The laughter of the children, the sounds of everyday life. These once comforting noises now felt distant, like echoes from a world that no longer held her. Her father's worried glances became more frequent, though he had yet to ask her what troubled her. He could not know, not the way she knew, that the forest's pull was far deeper than the surface of the woods. The jaguar man had not spoken, but Amara had begun to sense a change in him, a shift in the way he watched her. The fear she had glimpsed in his eyes that night at the stone pillar was still there, lurking beneath his calm exterior. Whatever lay ahead was a path he had walked before, though whether it had led him to safety or into the unknown, she could not say. The forest had become a labyrinth, its twisting paths and towering trees blurring the line between dream and reality. Every visit felt like a step into another world, one where time moved differently, where the weight of centuries rested on the roots beneath her feet. She had begun to spend hours walking in the woods, seeking answers that remained elusive, hoping that somehow the forest would reveal the truth she had only begun to understand. One evening, as dusk settled over the village, Amara found herself at the edge of the woods once more. The air was thick with the promise of rain, the sky darkening as storm clouds gathered above. There was a stillness in the air, as if the earth itself had paused, waiting for something to unfold. The jaguar man was with her, though she had not seen him approach. He moved with the quiet grace of the forest, his steps barely audible as they walked side by side, the distance between them growing smaller with each passing moment. This time, however, Amara did not head toward the familiar clearing. Instead, she walked deeper into the forest, past the paths she had once known, following a trail that seemed to call to her from the very core of the woods. The trees grew denser here, their trunks so close together that the daylight barely filtered through their branches. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and rain, and the further she walked, the more the world around her seemed to fade. The jaguar man's presence grew stronger as they moved deeper into the forest. His golden eyes glinted in the growing darkness, a silent guide leading her through the maze of trees. It was as if the forest had opened itself to them, revealing a path that had once been hidden, a road that only those with the deepest connection to its magic could find. Amara's heart beat faster as she walked, the sense of purpose growing within her with each step. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on her, the energy of the ancient woods humming beneath her skin. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to shimmer, thick with an unseen power that made her feel both grounded and untethered at once. Then, as if on cue, the trees began to open, revealing a vast clearing bathed in the pale light of the moon. The clearing was unlike any Amara had seen before. It was vast, the ground covered in a thick carpet of moss that glowed faintly in the moonlight, casting the space in an ethereal glow. At the center of the clearing stood another stone pillar, taller than the one in the previous clearing, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and move as Amara gazed at them. The air here was thick with an ancient energy, a presence that seemed to hum through the very fabric of the world. As they approached the pillar, Amara could feel the pull of its power, a magnetic force that drew her closer. The jaguar man stood beside her, his eyes locked on the pillar as if he too could sense its power. His body was tense, every muscle coiled in readiness, though he made no move to stop her. Amara reached out, her fingers brushing against the cool stone, and the moment her skin made contact, the world around her seemed to shift. The air vibrated with an electric hum, and the carvings on the stone flared to life, glowing with a soft, otherworldly light. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and for a brief moment, she felt as if she were standing on the edge of a great precipice, looking out into the void. A voice echoed in her mind, a voice not her own, but one that seemed to come from the very heart of the forest itself. It was a whisper, a soft murmur that filled the space around her, reverberating in her bones. The time has come. Amara's breath caught in her throat as the voice faded, leaving only the lingering hum of the pillar in its wake. She felt a shift within herself, a change that began deep inside her and radiated outward. The bond between her and the jaguar man, once a quiet presence, now surged with an intensity that left her breathless. It was as though the forest itself had chosen her, had called her to this moment, to this place, and now there was no turning back. The jaguar man stepped forward, his form shifting before her eyes. For a fleeting moment, his human features blurred, and in their place stood the jaguar, a sleek, powerful creature with golden eyes that glowed like twin suns. He was not just a man, not just a beast, but something in between, something that belonged to the forest itself. Amara watched in awe as the transformation took place, a sense of understanding dawning within her. The jaguar man was not just a guardian of the forest, but a part of it. He was bound to its magic, just as she now was. The forest's secrets were not his alone to carry. They were hers to share, hers to protect. The weight of this realization pressed down on her shoulders, but it also filled her with a strange sense of purpose. The jaguar man, now fully in his jaguar form, stepped closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. The bond between them was undeniable, the forest's power flowing through both of them, an energy older than time itself. They were no longer two separate beings. They were one, bound by the forest's magic and by the promise that had been made long ago. Amara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the truth settle in her chest. The time had come. There was no more running, no more hiding from the magic that had chosen her. She was a part of it now, and the forest's secrets were her burden to bear. As the Jaguar Man stepped back, his form shifting once more into the man she had come to know, he gave her a look, an unspoken acknowledgement of the bond between them. He did not speak, but there was no need for words. The understanding between them was clear. The moonlight bathed the clearing in a soft, silvery glow, and Amara felt the forest pulse with life around her. She was no longer just a visitor here. She had become a part of its story, a chapter in its endless history. And as the Jaguar Man stood beside her, she knew that their journey had only just begun. The veil of unspoken truths had lifted, but new mysteries awaited them, and together, they would face whatever the forest had in store. Chapter 12. The Heartbeat of the Wild. The days blurred into one another as Amara and the Jaguar Man continued their journey through the forest, each step further drawing her into its depths. She could feel the changes in herself, subtle but undeniable. Her senses were sharper, her body more attuned to the pulse of the earth beneath her feet. The forest was no longer just a place of mystery and awe. It had become her home, its rhythms syncing with her own. Each tree, each rustling leaf, whispered a secret she was beginning to understand. The Jaguar Man was always there, close but distant, a shadow at the edges of her consciousness. His presence had become a constant, a silent companion whose very being seemed to resonate with the wildness of the forest. Amara had long since stopped questioning his true nature, for she had come to accept that he was as much a part of the woods as the towering trees or the ancient stone pillars. He was the guardian, the protector, but more than that, he was her guide, leading her deeper into the forest's heart, where its true magic awaited. There were times when the air itself seemed to hum with energy, the trees shuddering as if they, too, were alive and aware. During these moments, Amara would feel the Jaguar Man's gaze upon her, heavy and knowing, though he never spoke. His silence was as much a part of their connection as his proximity, and Amara had learned to listen to the quiet between them, the unsaid words, the shared understanding. But as the days passed, a strange tension began to settle between them, a shift that Amara could not ignore. The bond that had once felt unbreakable now seemed fragile, a delicate thread that wavered with every step they took together. The forest, once a sanctuary, had begun to feel more like a cage. Amara could not shake the feeling that the deeper she ventured, the more the forest was demanding of her, its pull growing stronger, its magic more insistent. It was as if the land itself was awakening, and with it, the ancient power that had bound her to the Jaguar Man. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a dusky purple, Amara found herself standing at the edge of the forest. The village was visible in the distance, its lights flickering like distant stars. She hadn't been back in days, the pull of the woods too strong to resist. But tonight, the sight of the village stirred something within her, a longing she hadn't felt in weeks. She could feel the Jaguar Man's presence beside her, his body tense as he, too, sensed the change in the air. The silence between them grew heavier, thick with unspoken words. Amara had learned to read the Jaguar Man's subtle cues, his silent gestures, and the way he moved. Tonight, however, there was something different in the way he stood, something that seemed to ripple through the air, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Amara took a step forward, her eyes lingering on the distant lights of the village. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her, the path before her unclear. The forest had become her world, yes, but she was still tethered to the village. to the life she had known before. The Jaguar Man had always been her guide, but she realized now that it was up to her to decide which way to go. The forest's heartbeat pulsed in her chest, a rhythm that matched her own, but beyond it lay the world she had left behind. Her gaze turned back to the Jaguar Man, whose golden eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. The weight of the forest's magic hung between them, and Amara could feel the truth of it, the ancient power, the promises made long ago. She knew that whatever path she chose now would change everything. There was no going back. The Jaguar Man stepped forward, closing the distance between them. For the first time in what felt like ages, Amara felt his presence fully. His heat, the raw power that radiated from him like an untamed force. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, and in that touch, Amara felt the world shift once more. It was as though the very fabric of reality had bent, warping around the unspoken bond between them. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to sink into the sensation of the forest's pulse, the Jaguar Man's presence, the ancient magic that surrounded them both. It was no longer just the land that called to her, but the wildness that lived within her as well, the part of her that had always been there, waiting to be awakened. As the wind stirred through the trees, the distant sound of a storm rolling in, Amara felt a new clarity wash over her. The Jaguar Man's presence, once a source of comfort, now felt like a tether, one that she was no longer sure she wanted to be bound by. The forest had shown her the power that lay within it and within herself. But the world beyond the trees still beckoned, its lights a reminder of the life she had left behind, a life that she was not ready to let go of. The Jaguar Man's gaze never wavered from hers, and in that moment, Amara knew that the choice was hers to make. The forest would always be there, its heart beating in time with hers, but it was no longer just the forest that held her. She had begun to hold herself, to shape her own destiny. She turned away from the Jaguar Man, her steps carrying her toward the village. The forest whispered behind her, the trees groaning with the weight of her decision, but she did not look back. The Jaguar Man did not follow. As Amara walked back toward the village, the night air cool against her skin, she realized that the forest had given her something far more powerful than magic. It had given her freedom. The freedom to choose, to decide who she was, and what she would become. And though the forest's heartbeat would always echo within her, she knew now that she was the one who would shape the rhythm of her life. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Amara was ready to walk her own path. Chapter 13. When Eternity Beckons. The village had never seemed so distant. The closer Amara drew to the familiar houses and cobblestone streets, the more she felt as though she were stepping back into a world she no longer belonged to. The sounds of the village, the low murmur of voices, the soft creak of wooden doors, felt muffled, as if they belonged to someone else, to another version of her life that she could no longer access. The forest, with its mysterious, whispering magic, seemed to be fading with every step she took, its call growing fainter the further she distanced herself from its reach. And yet, the weight of its power still pressed on her chest, suffocating and persistent, as if the trees themselves had left their mark on her soul. She could feel it in the way her skin prickled when the wind swept through the village, as though something was missing, something she could not name. The Jaguar Man's presence was still a shadow in her mind, though she had not seen him since she had turned away from the edge of the forest. His absence felt like an ache in her chest, a gnawing emptiness that reminded her of the path she had chosen. Yet, the desire to be free, to return to the life she had known, held her tightly in its grip. The village had once been everything to her, and now it felt like the only place where she could remain tethered to the world she had always known. But the pull of the forest, the bond she shared with the Jaguar Man, remained. a thread tying her to a fate that seemed both inevitable and terrifying. Her father had not yet returned from his work in the village's fields, and Amara was left alone in the house, her thoughts swirling like the storm clouds that had begun to gather on the horizon. She had not yet told him of her long absence, of the days spent wandering the forest, of the jaguar man, and of the vision that had shaken her to the core. She could feel his concern growing with each passing day, his eyes searching hers for signs of the girl he once knew, the girl who had not been changed by the forest's magic. But she could no longer deny the truth to herself. She had changed irrevocably. In the quiet of the house, as evening fell and the shadows stretched long across the floor, Amara found herself sitting by the window, staring out at the world that felt both familiar and foreign. The firelight flickered in the hearth, casting its warm glow across the room, but it did little to ease the chill that had settled deep inside her. Her thoughts kept returning to the jaguar man, to the forest, and to the choice she had made. She could not turn back now, not after everything that had happened. The forest had given her the gift of knowledge, of magic, but it had also revealed a truth she was not ready to face. She was bound to it, as much as she was bound to the village, to the life she had once known. The sound of the door creaking open interrupted her reverie, and Amara's heart skipped in her chest. She had not expected her father to return so soon. She quickly wiped her eyes, as if the simple act could erase the depth of the turmoil within her. Her father entered, his tired eyes scanning the room before falling on her. He said nothing, but the weight of his gaze said everything. He could see the change in her, just as she could feel the change in herself. He placed a small bundle of herbs on the table, his hands trembling slightly as he did so. The lines on his face had deepened over the past few weeks, the stress of the world outside pressing on him in ways Amara had not fully understood until now. He was not a young man, and the years had begun to weigh on him. The quiet of the house, the flickering firelight, everything seemed to hold a tension between them, as if both of them were waiting for something to break, for some unspoken truth to come to light. Amara's thoughts drifted again to the forest, to the jaguar man who had always been so close yet so far. She could feel his presence in her bones, a reminder of the choice she had made, the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her days. The forest had not let her go, and neither had the jaguar man. In the depths of her heart, she knew she had chosen a path that would lead her back to the wilderness, but she did not know if she was ready to return. Her father cleared his throat, his voice soft and careful. "Amara," he began, his eyes searching her face. "You've been distant lately." His words were like a gentle probe, an attempt to understand what had changed in his daughter, to bridge the gap that had grown between them. But Amara could not answer. She could not explain the things she had seen, the visions of the jaguar man, the forest's whispers that had filled her mind in ways she had not known were possible. She could not explain the powerful connection that had formed between them, nor the ancient magic that still clung to her like a second skin. She could not tell him about the world she had glimpsed, a world of wildness and beauty, a world that had called to her in ways she could not ignore. It was a world that had claimed her, and in doing so, it had set her apart from everything she had known. Her father took a seat across from her, his expression softening with concern, but there was something else in his eyes, a sorrow, a quiet understanding, as if he too knew that she had been touched by something beyond his comprehension, beyond the world they had both known. Amara looked away, her eyes focusing on the window once more. The storm clouds had gathered fully now, the sky darkening as the wind picked up. She could hear the distant rumble of thunder, the promise of rain to come. She could feel the weight of the coming storm in the air, and it mirrored the storm that raged within her. A tempest of emotions, of desires, of fears, all tangled together in a way that left her breathless. Her father sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. "I know you've changed," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But no matter where you go, you'll always be my daughter." The words hung in the air, a simple declaration that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of love, of concern, and of a bond that could not be broken, no matter how far apart they grew. But Amara could not bring herself to respond. She could feel the Jaguar man's presence again, his shadow looming just beyond the window, waiting for her, just as the forest waited. She had made her choice, but the weight of that choice was crushing, a burden that she could not escape. The pull of the wild was too strong, and it had changed her in ways she could no longer deny. As the storm broke outside, the rain falling in torrents against the windows, Amara closed her eyes, allowing the darkness to wash over her. She could feel the Jaguar man's eyes on her once more, the silent call of the forest too powerful to ignore. The weight of her decision pressed on her chest, and the truth that had been slowly building in her heart now came to the surface. There was no turning back now. The forest had claimed her, and in doing so, it had taken her heart. And though she could not yet fully understand the depths of her connection to the Jaguar man, she knew that the only path left for her to walk was the one that led back to the wild, to the heartbeat of the forest. The weight of untold sorrows would be her burden to bear, but it would also be her strength. And as the storm raged outside, she knew that the next chapter of her life had already begun. Chapter 14. The Cage of the Mortal Heart. Amara had not slept in days. The nights stretched long, tangled in the uncertainty of her choices, the heavy weight of the forest's magic still clinging to her skin. She could feel the Jaguar man's presence lingering at the edges of her thoughts, his essence woven into the very fabric of her being, as if the wild pulse of the forest had become a part of her own heartbeat. And yet, there was a restlessness in her, a hunger for something she could not define, that gnawed at her more sharply with each passing hour. It was not the silence of the village that unsettled her. It was the stillness, the quiet that had once been comforting but now felt suffocating. The distant murmur of voices, the hum of daily life, felt like a backdrop to her own internal chaos. She could no longer ignore the call of the wild, a call that had grown louder, more insistent, echoing through the deepest parts of her mind. The forest was not just a place of refuge anymore. It was an extension of herself, a living, breathing entity that had marked her as its own. Each morning, as the sun rose above the horizon, Amara would stand at the edge of the village, her gaze drawn inevitably toward the trees. The woods beckoned to her, their shadows stretching long across the land, promising something she could not yet fully understand. The Jaguar man's absence only deepened the ache within her, a constant reminder that she had made a decision, one that had severed her connection to everything she had known, to the life she had once taken for granted. But the pull of the forest remained, unyielding, powerful. And with each passing day, it became harder and harder to resist. Her father had been watching her with increasing concern. He noticed her absences, the long hours spent wandering the village streets, her restless movements as she lingered in the doorway, staring out at the distant trees. He no longer asked where she went or what she did. He could see the shift within her, the same shift that had altered everything about their lives when they first arrived at the village. But even in his silence, there was a quiet understanding between them, a shared sorrow that neither knew how to articulate. The storm that had swept through the village a week ago had left the air thick with the scent of wet earth, the trees glistening with rain. The wind still howled at night, rattling the shutters and bending the branches of the ancient oak trees. But it was not the storm that troubled her. It was the feeling that something else was coming, something far greater than the winds or the rain, something that would demand everything she had left to give. And then, one evening, the first hint of her destiny arrived. It was twilight when the air around her shifted. a sudden drop in temperature that sent a shiver down her spine. The birds stopped singing, the usual rustle of the trees growing still. The village seemed to hold its breath, as if nature itself had paused, waiting. Amara stepped outside, her feet guided by an unseen force, and walked toward the forest's edge. Her heart raced, her pulse quickening in anticipation. She did not know why she had come this far. She only knew that the forest had called her again, that the jaguar man's presence was near. As she crossed the boundary that separated the village from the woods, a sensation washed over her. Something ancient and powerful, like a veil being lifted from her eyes. The air was thick with energy, crackling with the unspoken magic that had always been present but now seemed to surge in waves. The trees, their bark dark and glistening, seemed to lean toward her, as though they were alive, aware of her arrival. The forest was waiting, just as she was. She walked deeper, the ground soft beneath her feet, the scent of moss and pine filling her senses. The path that had once been hidden, cloaked in the shadows of the trees, was now clear to her, as if it had always been there, waiting for her to find it. She followed the trail through the dense underbrush, her heart beating in sync with the rhythm of the earth beneath her. The jaguar man's presence was near. She could feel him, a heat in the air, a pulse in the distance. The deeper she went, the more the forest seemed to consume her, the trees closing in around her, their branches twisting and stretching above her like ancient hands, guiding her forward. The world around her faded, the village, her father, all of it dissolved into the murmur of the wind through the leaves, the rustle of small creatures scurrying beneath the earth. She was no longer just Amara, the girl who had come to this place in search of a life she could not find. She was part of something much older, much greater, a being bound to the forest, to its magic, to its ancient secrets. And then, through the haze of shadows and moonlight, she saw him. The jaguar man stood before her, his form half hidden in the dark undergrowth, his golden eyes glowing like embers in the night. He was as she remembered him, though somehow more wild, more untamed, as if the very earth had imprinted its essence upon him. He was no longer just a man, nor just a beast. He was something more, something that transcended the boundaries of human and animal, a creature forged by the forest's will. And Amara knew, in that moment, that he was not just a guardian of the woods. He was its heartbeat, its soul, its power-given form. His gaze locked with hers, and for a long moment, neither moved. The air between them hummed with a tension that was almost unbearable, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them both. Amara could feel his power, his strength, radiating from him like a storm waiting to break. And yet there was something in his eyes, a sadness, a longing, that echoed her own feelings. He, too, had been changed by the forest, by the magic that flowed through the land, and he understood the choice she faced. It was a choice that had always been before her, one that she could no longer ignore. The jaguar man was a part of her, as much a part of her as the earth beneath her feet, the trees above her head, the blood in her veins. The forest had claimed her, had marked her as its own, and no matter how hard she tried to resist, no matter how far she ran, she would always be bound to it. But the forest was not the only force at play here. There was something else, something darker, something that had been pulling at her from the very beginning. She could feel it in the air, a pressure building, a storm on the horizon. The magic that had drawn her to this place, that had tied her to the jaguar man, was not just the forest's magic. It was something older, something deeper, a power that had existed long before the trees had grown tall or the rivers had carved their paths through the earth. It was the power of the abyss, the darkness that had always existed at the edges of the world, waiting to consume everything. And it was calling to her now, as much a part of her as the wild magic that surged within her veins. Amara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the choice before her. The abyss called, the jaguar man called, and the forest called. All of them were a part of her now, and all of them demanded something in return. The storm in her heart was coming to a head, and the time to make her final choice was fast approaching. Would she answer the call of the abyss, the dark force that promised power beyond imagining? Or would she choose the wild, the magic of the forest, the jaguar man? Her true path, her true destiny? She took a step forward, her body moving as if guided by an unseen force, her heart pounding in her chest. The jaguar man's eyes followed her, his form shifting like a shadow in the moonlight. And as Amara stepped into the darkness, she knew that her life would never be the same again. Chapter 15. The Path of Two Souls. The world shifted, a momentary blur of shadow and light, as if time itself had stilled in anticipation. Amara stood at the threshold of destiny, where the forest and the abyss met, her heart heavy with the weight of her choice. The air around her was thick, charged with the pulse of ancient power, the tension palpable. It was as though the very earth held its breath, waiting for her next step, for the final act that would decide not just her future, but the future of everything she had come to know. The jaguar man stood close, his presence a constant hum in the background of her thoughts, a whisper that reverberated through her very soul. His eyes, those golden orbs, shone like twin stars, burning with a light that was both comforting and unsettling. He was still, but she could feel the storm within him, the force that had held him back for so long, the wild power of the forest that coursed through his veins, binding him to this place, to her. The wind shifted, rustling the leaves above her, and for a fleeting moment, the trees seemed to part, revealing the vast expanse of the forest in all its untamed glory. The darkness beyond the woods loomed, an ever-present reminder of the choice she had made, the pull of the abyss that tugged at the very core of her being. It was not a pull of fear, nor one of desire, but something deeper, a need, an inevitability that echoed through her blood, through the very fabric of her existence. The abyss was not an enemy, nor a force to be feared. It was a part of her, just as much as the forest, just as much as the jaguar man. Her feet moved before she could think, stepping forward into the heart of the darkness, guided by an unseen hand, an instinct she could not deny. The jaguar man did not follow, but she felt his gaze burn into her back, an unspoken plea that tugged at her heart. But she could not stop. Not now. Not when the call of the abyss was so near, so overwhelming, pulling her deeper into its fold. The forest whispered, its branches bending and twisting in the wind, a symphony of voices that carried with them the secrets of ages. It was no longer just the forest of her childhood, the one she had known and loved. It had transformed, become something older, something far greater than she could have ever imagined. The magic that flowed through her veins now was not just the magic of the trees and the earth. It was the magic of creation itself, the very force that had shaped the world, the balance between light and dark, life and death. As she walked deeper into the woods, the shadows grew darker, the air colder. The light from the moon faded, swallowed by the encroaching gloom. The trees stretched higher, their branches reaching toward the heavens, as if they too sought something beyond the limits of the world. She could feel them watching, could feel their eyes upon her, waiting. They were a part of her now, just as much as she was a part of them. Her mind, once clouded with doubt, now cleared as if the fog had lifted, revealing the truth that had always been within her. She had known it from the moment she had stepped into the forest, from the moment she had met the jaguar man. The abyss and the forest were not opposing forces. They were two sides of the same coin, two halves of the same whole. The darkness was not to be feared. It was to be embraced. Just as the light was to be cherished, so too was the shadow, for without one, the other could not exist. Amara closed her eyes, feeling the energy of the world swirl around her, wrapping her in its embrace. The Jaguar man's presence remained close, a constant pulse at the edges of her awareness, but he was not the one she sought. It was the forest, the magic, the ancient force that had guided her here. It was her true path, her true destiny. The earth beneath her feet seemed to tremble, a low hum vibrating through her body. The abyss called again, but this time it was not a whisper. It was a roar, a tidal wave of power that surged through the very fabric of her being. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, an overwhelming rush of energy that threatened to consume her. But she did not falter. She embraced it, allowed the darkness to wash over her, to fill every corner of her soul. The Jaguar man's form appeared before her once more, stepping out from the shadows like a predator stalking its prey. But this time, there was no fear in his eyes, only understanding, only acceptance. He did not need to follow her, for he knew that this was her journey, her path to walk alone. She had chosen the darkness, and in doing so, had become something more than she had ever dreamed. He was the guardian of the forest, the protector of its secrets, but she was something beyond that. She was the bridge between the two realms, the one who could weave the magic of both the light and the shadow, who could command the forces that had shaped the world. And so, as the storm raged around them, Amara took her place in the heart of the abyss, the Jaguar man's gaze upon her like a final blessing. The darkness was no longer something to fear. It was a part of her, as much as the forest, as much as the Jaguar man. The two forces were one, and she was their keeper. With a final breath, she closed her eyes, her heart beating in time with the pulse of the earth. The world shifted once more, and Amara, the girl who had once been lost, now stood at the center of it all, the embodiment of both light and shadow, of creation and destruction. The forest would flourish, the darkness would remain, and she would be its eternal guardian. The Jaguar man stepped back into the shadows, his form melding with the night. Amara stood alone, but she was not afraid. She was whole, and as the last of the moonlight disappeared beyond the horizon, Amara felt the pull of eternity, a call not of the forest, nor of the abyss, but of something greater, something beyond time itself. She had become a part of that eternity, an eternal force that would continue to shape the world for as long as the earth itself would turn. In that moment, she knew this was not an end. It was only the beginning.